Today is Wednesday, December 11th, 2024, and the 2026 governor's race is already underway as we at Atlanta News First have been covering. Attorney General Chris Carr entered the race a couple of weeks ago, becoming the first announced candidate in the 2026 governor's race, and it will be a wide open contest. Thanks for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First. I'm Tim Darnell, and we're joined by our favorite political analyst and someone who has been very gracious with his time and energy and insight into our political coverage here at Atlanta News First. That is Dr. Benjamin Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University. Dr. Taylor, are you surprised that Attorney General Chris Carr has announced his candidacy so early? We are still a year and a half, a couple of years away from the 2026 governor's race. We all know that Governor Brian Kemp is prohibited from seeking a third term, meaning the 26 governor's race will be wide open with no incumbent. Tell us your reaction when you heard Attorney General Chris Carr had thrown his hat into the ring.
Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me again, Tim. I love to talk with you about Georgia politics. But regarding Attorney General Carr, I was not at all surprised that he got into the race. It was notable that he got into the race as early as he did. And I think the explanation for that is, well, what you've alluded to already, which is that there are several folks in the executive branch of the Georgia state government who would probably like to put their hat in the ring. And I think Attorney General Carr understands that as well and is trying to get ahead of those folks. One, you get the headlines. Two, you can start to solidify donors. Three, you can start to solidify your political base. And the fact of the matter is that as Attorney General, Attorney Generals are, by Georgia Constitution, pretty powerful. They're constitutionally probably the second most powerful executive office, second to the governor, of course. And so Attorney General Carr has been involved with a lot of high-profile things during his time as Attorney General. And it also makes sense that given the fact that Governor Kemp is relatively popular and is a two-term governor himself, I think he would like to lay claim to the mantle of being the logical successor because, again, the governor and the attorney general typically work fairly closely together. They're often sort of making news on the same issues together. So it makes some sense that Attorney General Carr would want to get out first because, of course, you've got Lieutenant Governor Burt, who is another potential candidate. You have Secretary of State Raffensperger, who is another potential candidate. All three of these folks have made quite a name for themselves, as much as you can, being not the top of the executive branch, but in the executive branch at the state level. And so I think it makes a lot of sense, as I said, for Attorney General Carr to get out early for all the reasons I've mentioned.
Insofar as Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is concerned, he is a very strong ally of President-elect Donald Trump. Right. Secretary of State Raffensperger was not on former President Trump's favorite list or list of favorite people a few years ago, given what happened in 2020. Attorney General Carr seems to have really kept himself out of a lot of the controversy surrounding the 45th and now soon to be the 47th President of the United States. How do you think that will impact his candidacy in 2026?
Well, the first thing that any of these well, in the case of Attorney General Carr, he's a candidate, but the other folks also, they got to win the primary first. And so Secretary of State Raffensperger will have his work cut out for him because the fact of the matter is that though there are people like former Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan who would say that the Republican Party is bigger than Donald Trump, I think the evidence is the contrary. President Trump is the Republican Party, and Republicans sort of like have his agenda in mind. And so I think to the extent that Secretary of State Raffensperger has had conflict with the president-elect, former president-elect in the past, that could potentially be a problem for him in a Republican primary. The primary is in a political time a long time from now. So, but partisans, the strongest partisans are the people who participate in primaries, and they have long memories, and they don't forget about these things. And so, while Secretary of State Raffensperger was the top Republican vote getter in 2022, it will be notable if he has some headwinds in the primary. But again, as you point out, Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones has been a real close Trump ally. But I think the key thing to remember for the purposes of the primary is that Attorney General Carr, being the Attorney General and having made a lot of headlines and being sort of a law and order type candidate, both as Attorney General and then has made a lot of his agenda about law and order type stuff. I mean, that really, really works in a Republican primary. So he'll have a great sort of message to run on, one assumes. The question will be, does the message resonate compared to the very possible, probable, who can say, but the possible endorsement of Burt Jones by the sitting president at the time? You know, these are variables we can't know right now, but these are all possibilities for 2026 that will make the Republican gubernatorial primary very, very interesting, to say the least.
Insofar as Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones is concerned, we are only a few weeks away from the 2025-26 legislative session when lawmakers return to Atlanta for their 40 legislative day session. Lieutenant Governor Jones is the president of the Senate and therefore is pretty powerfully, has a lot of legislative and political power in the Senate. What are some of the legislative priorities that you think he may be focusing on if he is indeed about to, or if he will indeed launch a 26 gubernatorial campaign?
Well, I think what you've seen Lieutenant Governor Jones do over the last couple of years, which has been very politically savvy, is he has been a fairly close ally in large part to Governor Kemp. And Governor Kemp being a very popular Republican governor, as we've said, with a Republican majority in both chambers, that makes a lot of political sense to be, you know, sort of seen as the key cog in the legislative process for the governor's agenda. You know, include in the Senate, particularly as you point out. But I think that, you know, the strategy most likely there may be some areas where Lieutenant Governor Jones tries to break out. Like I've seen some reporting that he may come out in favor of Medicaid expansion, which has not been done in Georgia, whereas other states have done that, part of the Affordable Care Act expansion process in the last decade. But so that's a potential area of sort of making a path for himself. But on the other hand, you know, the governor is going to have a pretty robust and aggressive agenda himself based on reports in the last few days about what his agenda will be. And we'll know more in January specifically about the budget and things of that nature. So my sense would be that Lieutenant Governor Jones would likely sort of highlight the ways in which he has helped Governor Kemp get his agenda put in place so far, and then sort of be the main advocate in the legislature for that going forward, and sort of make his leadership evident in that way. And then that also, by the way, because it's important to realize too, you know, members of the legislature are going to be on the ballot with these folks, whoever the nominee is. And so if Lieutenant Governor Jones can demonstrate his capacity as a leader in the Senate with the senators and then across the other chamber in the House, then you know, it may be a way to get some allies in the primary process so that they can sort of help get out the vote efforts and do vote targeting and that kind of thing. Though everyone's running their own campaigns, these kinds of connections are very, very important, particularly in a contested race where, you know, if all three of these folks and then whoever else might get in the race as well, there are other folks who may have their eyes on it too, then you're looking at potentially a runoff, all right, in the primary. And so that again brings up all other sort of electioneering issues of, you know, who are your allies, where their turn out the vote efforts and vote targeting measures and things like this. So all of that matters. So that would be you know, the most likely strategy for Lieutenant Governor is work hard and be nice with the members of the legislature and sort of be the main point person, sort of be seen as the governor's heir apparent, right? If everyone understands, oh, well, we love Governor Kemp, and it just makes so much, this guy is like Governor Kemp 2.0, right? With maybe something different on the margins, but basically it's the same thing. Let's keep it going, right? That's the idea. So.
And talking about some of the other candidates, two names that have been in the news recently, David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, both former United States senators. Kelly Loeffler will be heading up the Small Business Administration, presumably, and David Perdue, U.S. ambassador to China. Both of those names are very prominent in the Georgia Republican Party. Both are very solidly in the camp of support for president-elect Donald Trump. They have been possibly rumored as seeking uh, elective office in 2026. What happens now? I'm assuming these appointments from former President-elect Donald Trump don't necessarily preclude either David Perdue or Kelly Loeffler from re-entering the political arena in 2026 or beyond.
That's right. They could absolutely use this as a springboard, although I had to say that in both it wouldn't be unheard of for this to happen, but it also isn't the most likely. Like, how many small business administration, leadership folks have made it into electoral politics? So it's a very sort of bureaucratic, technocratic, really kind of job. In a lot of ways. It's the same with ambassador to China. I mean, that's a very crucial position, right? So that's sort of a feather in former Senator Perdue's cap in terms of the trust being given to him to sort of be the American spokesperson with the Chinese government on a day-to-day basis. But at the same time, he has a lot of experience, right? He's a CEO of Dollar General, and there's a lot of big business, which of course has a lot of engagement with China, Chinese manufacturing, things like that. So it makes a lot of sense from a practical point of view. And it's always, these kinds of things also keep you in touch with donors and movers and shakers, as it were, in your relative political party. And so, if either of them have aspirations for the future, certainly being involved in this level of politics is crucial to keep that sort of those connections going and that social network. But in terms of will they run? It's very possible. It's who knows what their own plans are. But I think the more likely scenario is that but I should say too that if they wanted to run for office, these positions often don't last much longer than a couple of years. Ambassadorships can actually, that's a little different. But particularly for something like bureaucratic political appointments, they don't last much longer than a couple of years. Typically, sometimes you get someone who lasts an entire administration, 4 years. But so yeah, I mean, I think it's possible that these positions could be used as a way to um, keep people in the public eye and then keep their relationships with donors going, and then maybe give them an opportunity to run for office in the future.
We're obviously talking about the 2026 governor's race here in Georgia with Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, talking about the man at the top, Governor Brian Kemp, two-term governor coming up on his final legislative session starting in only a couple of weeks in early January. There has been a lot of speculation over his political future. He is a very popular Republican governor, whether or not he maintains his good relations with President-elect Donald Trump, as they seem to kind of repair their relationship a little bit, at least publicly, in the latter weeks of the recent 2024 presidential election, grooming himself perhaps for higher office, and yet really the only place other than Georgia governor in Georgia elected politics that Brian Kemp can go higher than where he is right now is U.S. Senator. Democratic Senator John Ossoff is coming up for re-election in 2026, and yet I can only recall and really count on one hand the number of incumbent Georgia U.S. senators who were unsuccessful in their reelection bid, going back to Herman Talmadge in the 1980s and perhaps yeah, Republican Mac Mattingly defeated him, relative unknown, a couple of others. But am I wrong in saying that it's very hard to unseat a sitting incumbent senator in Georgia unless he has become embroiled in some really serious allegations of misconduct, or it's just at the ill fortune of whatever political winds may happen to be blowing at that time?
Yeah, this is a really good question, Tim. I think if you are John Ossoff, you may not have been very happy with the outcome of the presidential elections from a policy point of view, but from a personal political future point of view, it's good news for John Ossoff because if he were trying to run for re-election as a member of the president's party, his task would be much more difficult. As it is, he will be running as a member of the opposing party to the president. And if there's anything close to a scientific law about American politics, it is that the president's party usually loses seats, and sometimes in massive ways in midterm elections. And so the fact of the matter is that Donald Trump, as now in his second term to be upcoming, he's a lame duck president, like starting off. So that always comes with some political vulnerabilities, just in terms of like why people pay attention to you. But that's also going to be sort of the sort of surge and decline theory of midterm elections. The president got a boost. People come out to vote in presidential elections, and the people who come out to vote in midterm elections are typically those people who are the most upset or the most antagonistic to the sitting president, and that would likely benefit Senator Ossoff. Uh, which, sort of the opposite of what happened for David Perdue, in a sense, even though that was presidential elections, a little different. But the bottom line is that I think Senator Ossoff is going to be in a much better political position, all things being equal, with a Republican president than with a Democratic president. The tricky part here is that the Georgia bench for the Senate is relatively deep, starting with Governor Kemp, of course. And then, of course, a lot of people you've mentioned already to run for governor, or Perdue or Loeffler themselves, who were senators. I mean, the bench is very deep, right? Both with electoral success in the past, not so much for Loeffler, but for Perdue and these other folks, they've shown they can win statewide elections. So Ossoff has to run a good campaign. He has to be aware of as you point out, the political headwinds, as it were, and what's going on politically, and has to hope that some things line up in his favor. But as a Democrat running with an incumbent running during a Republican administration, that is going to be a much better sort of electoral scenario than would have happened if Vice President Harris had won the election. So, but the real question becomes, does Governor Kemp run for Senate? I don't know, right? You'd be shocked to know I don't know Brian Kemp. So I couldn't tell you the inner workings of his mind, but I can tell you that based on his career, I would not be shocked that he ran for Senate, but I would be somewhat surprised. He's been in the executive branch of the Georgia government for a long time. He was in the legislature for a short period of time, and he notably was the Secretary of State, not Lieutenant Governor, which is effectively a de facto legislative position in some sense. It's executive branch, but because you're in charge of the Senate and the Senate, it gives you a lot of responsibilities. It becomes a legislative thing. And so the result is that Brian Kemp has spent a lot of his elected life as an executive doing executive actions and executive things. And though governors have to work very closely with the legislature, the governor of Georgia is a relatively powerful chief executive among the 50 governors. And I think that being a senator is a generally, uh, just generally a thankless task and not something that a sitting governor would relish doing if they like doing the kinds of things executives do, which is my sense of Governor Kemp. So, does he want to run for Senate? I don't know. Would he be a very strong candidate? Yes. But the real question becomes, is that the job? Is that the elected position that he wants? And that's the question we have to wait to see him answer, I think. And we'll that again, we'll just have to wait and see what his decision is. But my sense, if you just look at his behavior over the last while, the last couple of years, and going into this session and the next two legislative sessions, my sense is that he is setting himself up to try to run for president in 2028. And so,
Wow.
senators run for president. That's what they do, right? But so do former governors. And, the model here may be the last and the only governor of Georgia to become president, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter spent the two intervening years from his leaving office in January of 1975 to the 76 election campaign. He spent that time sort of gathering supporters and going through meeting supporters in Iowa, New Hampshire, and doing all the things President Kennedy at a time when that kind of thing was still sort of a novel way to go about getting the nomination. But he had that sort of experience as a governor and was able to use that to his advantage. And so I think that's sort of the model actually for Governor Kemp is to use the intervening time to go if he wants to run for president, to use that time to go around, gather support, sort of come into the primary season with a head of steam, make a name for yourself that way, get in good with the real activists and folks like that. And that's how you make a splash, having not been in office for a couple of years.
So even the 26 governor's races will be wide open, and obviously the 28 presidential race will be wide open, as Donald Trump will not be able to run for a third term in office. We're going to continue to follow all of these fascinating political developments as Georgia continues its role as one of the most preeminent states in the nation for political development, political actions, and political observations. Thanks to Dr. Ben Taylor, professor of political science at Kennesaw State University, for joining us on this edition of Political Update. Thanks all of you for watching and listening. And remember, Political Update airs every Wednesday at 1 or 1:30 p.m. You can also watch and listen to Political Update and all of the Atlanta News First podcasts on our YouTube channel and wherever you download your favorite podcast on whatever platform you choose, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, or others. Thanks for watching and listening again to this edition of Political Update from Atlanta News First.